Nobody in town believed the billionaire had come for anything but a signature on a deed. They whispered that she only wanted the land, that the small house at the edge of Maple Hollow Road meant nothing to her beyond square footage and a closing date. But when the front door finally opened, what greeted her was not the poverty they had all imagined. Instead, she found a modest home cared for with a devotion that seemed almost impossible, where every object on every shelf seemed to be quietly telling a story, a promise that had never once been broken. Within minutes of stepping inside, she was standing in the middle of that living room, with tears sliding down her face. No one understood what she had seen there, not until the truth about the widowed man who lived alone in that house came out, and the whole town fell silent. Daniel Carter was 38 years old, and for most of his adult life, he had been someone people pointed to with quiet admiration. He had once been one of the most sought-after structural engineers on the eastern seaboard, the kind of mind that companies fought over, the kind of name that appeared on patents and blueprints for bridges and buildings that would outlive everyone who built them. He had offices waiting for him in 3 different cities. He had turned down 2 of them. Then his wife, Claire, got sick, and within 18 months, she was gone, and something in Daniel changed in a way the town never fully understood. He walked away from the career that had defined him. He packed up the apartment they had shared and moved back into his late parents' house on the outskirts of town, a modest 2-bedroom place with a sagging porch and a yard that had gone wild with weeds. He started fixing the place up himself, board by board, because he said he didn't trust anyone else to do it the way it needed to be done. Within a year, he had traded his engineering badge for a set of wrenches and taken up work repairing farm equipment for the local growers, and tractors and combines and old irrigation pumps that nobody else in 3 counties knew how to fix anymore. The town watched him with a kind of pity they never bothered to hide. They saw a man who had thrown away everything. They saw failure in the calluses on his hands and the grease under his fingernails. Mothers used him as a cautionary tale, the brilliant boy who let grief swallow his future whole. Old men at the diner shook their heads and said it was a damn shame, a waste of a good mind. Children who passed his house on bicycles sometimes slowed down to stare at the man fixing his own roof. The man who lived like someone twice his age, the man who never seemed to want anything more than his small patch of land and his quiet evenings. What none of them understood, what none of them could have guessed, was that Daniel could have walked back into 6 figures with a single phone call. He still received offers, sometimes letters from companies that remembered his name, sometimes calls from old colleagues who tried to lure him back with bigger numbers and better titles. He turned every one of them down without a second thought, because the life he had built in that small house, slow and quiet, and entirely his own, was the only life he wanted anymore. He had chosen peace over prestige, and in a town that measured a man's worth in salary and square footage, that choice looked like defeat. Daniel had not always lived this way, and the people of Maple Hollow seemed to forget that fact a little more with each passing year. Before Claire's diagnosis, he and his wife had lived in a bright apartment overlooking the river in the city, the kind of place young couples photographed for their friends because everything in it looked like proof that they were finally getting somewhere. Daniel had been the youngest senior engineer his firm had ever promoted, a man whose drawings ended up in glossy trade magazines, whose name was mentioned in hushed, respectful tones by professors teaching the next generation of students. Claire had taught 3rd grade at the elementary school 3 blocks from their building, and on weekends, they used to drive out to small towns just like this one, picking apples in autumn, wandering through farmers' markets, daydreaming aloud about a quieter life they always assumed they would have decades from then, once they had both slowed down enough to want it. Neither of them imagined that quieter life would arrive so suddenly, or for such a devastating reason. The diagnosis came on a Wednesday in March, a date Daniel still marked privately, though he never told anyone why. The months that followed blurred together into hospital corridors and waiting rooms, and a calendar crowded with appointments that all ended the same disappointing way. Daniel kept working through most of it, because work was the only thing that still felt familiar, still felt like something he had any control over. But control, he learned, was an illusion that medicine couldn't sustain forever. And when Claire passed in late autumn, Daniel found himself standing in an apartment that suddenly felt enormous and empty, surrounded by a life that no longer made any sense without her standing beside him in it. He sold the apartment within 3 months, He turned down the promotion that had been waiting for him before the diagnosis ever interrupted everything. He packed what remained of his old life into the back of a borrowed truck and drove 2 hours north to the house his parents had left him years earlier. A house he had visited only a handful of times since their own passing, half forgotten, half neglected, exactly the kind of blank, quiet space he needed to disappear into. Nobody in Maple Hollow understood, when he arrived, that the man unloading boxes onto that sagging porch had once stood in rooms full of investors discussing million-dollar infrastructure projects. They only saw a stranger with sad eyes, moving into an old house nobody had lived in for years, and they drew their own conclusions long before they ever bothered to ask him a single honest question. Then, on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday in late September, news rippled through Maple Hollow like a stone thrown into still water. Sophia Hart, the billionaire real estate developer whose name appeared in business magazines and skyline headlines from coast to coast, was coming to town. Sophia Hart was 38 years old, the same age as Daniel, though their lives could not have looked more different from the outside. She ran one of the largest private real estate firms in the country, a company that had transformed entire neighborhoods, built towers where parking lots used to be, and turned forgotten stretches of land into gleaming developments worth hundreds of millions of dollars. She was known in boardrooms for her precision, and in headlines for her coldness, a woman who had clawed her way to the top of an industry that rarely made room for people who hesitated. Employees described her as someone who never blinked during a negotiation. Competitors described her as someone who never lost one. She had flown into town that week for a single purpose: to walk the parcel of land her company had targeted for its newest residential development, a sprawling project that promised to bring hundreds of new homes and millions in tax revenue to a county that desperately needed both. What the magazines never printed, what none of her employees ever knew, was that Sophia had built her empire from almost nothing. She had grown up in a cramped house outside Columbus, the only child of a father who worked nights at a manufacturing plant and a mother who cleaned office buildings before dawn, so the two of them could afford the modest mortgage on a street where every house looked exactly like the next. Sophia had worked her way through college on scholarships and side jobs, sold her first small property at 23, with money she had saved dollar by careful dollar, and never once looked back at the life she had come from. By the time she turned 30, she had built a reputation as someone who could see value in land that everyone else had written off, someone who could turn an overlooked parcel into a thriving development before her competitors even finished their first site visit. By 38, she ran a company worth more than most people could imagine, and she had convinced herself, somewhere along the way, that the distance she had put between herself and that small house in Ohio was simply the natural cost of success. There was just one problem standing directly in the middle of the planned development, and it was Daniel Carter's house. The land Daniel's small home sat on happened to occupy the exact center of the proposed site. The parcel every architectural drawing and engineering survey pointed toward as essential. Town officials assumed the matter would resolve itself within days. Everyone sells eventually, they told each other, especially when the number on the table climbs high enough. Sophia herself assumed the same thing when she requested the first meeting, expecting a quick conversation and a quicker signature. She sat across from Daniel in the back room of the town's only diner, slid a folder across the table containing an offer that would have made most people in that county set for life, and waited for the predictable response. She had prepared for the meeting the way she prepared for every acquisition, reviewing comparable sales in the region, calculating exactly how high she could go before the project's margins suffered, anticipating the questions a reluctant seller might ask, and the reassurances that usually close the gap. She had handled men far wealthier than Daniel Carter. Executives who postured and stalled, simply to drive the price upward. Farmers who wept at the kitchen table before signing anyway, because the number eventually became impossible to refuse. She had no reason to think this meeting would unfold any differently. Daniel arrived in work clothes, still faintly smelling of engine oil, shook her hand once, firmly, and sat down across from her without a trace of the nervousness she usually saw in people meeting her for the first time. Daniel didn't open the folder. He looked at it, then looked at her, and politely declined. Sophia blinked, genuinely caught off guard for the first time in longer than she could remember. She asked him plainly how much he wanted, certain that the number simply hadn't been high enough yet. certain that everyone, eventually, had a price. Daniel told her this wasn't about money at all. He said it quietly, without drama, the way a man speaks when he has already made peace with a decision long before the question was ever asked. Sophia pressed him, raised the offer on the spot, watched his face for the flicker of hesitation she had learned to read in 1,000 negotiations. It never came. For the first time in her career, someone had looked at tens of millions of dollars and simply said no, as though the number meant nothing at all measured against whatever it was he was protecting. It unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. That night, alone in her hotel room, Sophia found herself unable to let the conversation go, replaying it the way she might replay a deal that had unexpectedly fallen apart. She had built her entire career on understanding what people wanted, on finding the lever that moved them, and she had found nothing in Daniel Carter that moved at all. The next morning, against the advice of her own team, she decided she would go to the house herself, alone, without contracts or lawyers or anyone watching. She told her assistant it was due diligence. In truth, she simply needed to understand what kind of man turned down a fortune without blinking. When Sophia arrived at the house the following afternoon, she expected exactly what everyone in town had described to her. A man drowning in grief. A property falling apart at the seams, the kind of neglect that made selling an obvious mercy. She had pictured peeling paint, sagging gutters, the particular sadness of a home that had given up on itself. What she found instead made her stop on the porch steps before she had even knocked. She parked her rented sedan at the edge of the gravel drive and walked the rest of the way on foot, the way she sometimes did when she wanted a clearer first impression of a property before anyone inside could shape her opinion of it. The yard surprised her first. Rows of late-season vegetables grew in neat lines along one side of the house, staked and tended with obvious care. A row of maple saplings, clearly planted within the last few years, lined the edge of the property, each one wrapped at the base with protective mesh against deer. Nothing about the scene matched the picture of decline the townspeople had painted for her over coffee that morning, and by the time she reached the porch steps, her carefully prepared assumptions had already begun quietly unraveling. The house was small, modest by any measure, but it was immaculate in a way that startled her. The porch boards beneath her feet had been sanded and resealed recently enough that she could still smell the faint trace of varnish in the air. The window frames were freshly painted a soft, deliberate white. When Daniel opened the door and welcomed her inside, the interior revealed itself in layers that left her quietly speechless. Every piece of wooden furniture gleamed with the kind of polish that only came from regular, careful hands. The walls, though clearly old, had been patched and repainted with such precision that the repairs were nearly invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. An antique clock stood in the corner of the living room, its pendulum swinging steadily, its hands keeping perfect time. A worn armchair near the window had been mended along one seam, with stitching so careful it looked almost decorative rather than necessary. And then there was the dining table. It was a simple wooden table, clearly old, clearly loved, set near the kitchen window, where the afternoon light fell across it, in long golden strips. Sophia noticed it the way she noticed everything, quickly and completely. And what she noticed stopped her cold. The table was set for two. 2 plates, 2 glasses, 2 folded napkins, arranged with the kind of quiet ceremony reserved for someone who was expected at any moment. But Daniel lived alone. He had lived alone for years. There was no other car in the driveway, no sign of another resident anywhere in the house, no second coat hanging by the door. Sophia stood there staring at that table, feeling something she couldn't immediately name. Something that felt dangerously close to curiosity. And beneath the curiosity, something gentler still. She asked him about it, carefully, the way someone asks a question they suspect might open a door they aren't ready to walk through. Daniel didn't flinch. He simply pulled out a chair at the table and asked if she wanted to sit down, and for the first time since she had arrived in Maple Hollow, Sophia Hart, who never had time to sit anywhere, said yes. He told her about Claire, not all at once, and not with the practiced sorrow of someone who had told the story many times before, but slowly, the way a man speaks when the memory still lives somewhere close to the surface. They had been married for 9 years before the diagnosis came, he explained, and even after everything the doctors tried, the disease had taken her faster than anyone expected. In the final weeks, when she could no longer manage much beyond a few sentences at a time, She had made him promise her something simple, something that had nothing to do with money or grief management or moving on the way the support group suggested. She had asked him to keep their home full of life, not preserved like a museum, she told him, not frozen the way some widowers freeze a house, but alive, cared for, lived in, the way it had been when they were happy inside it together. He described, almost shyly, the particular details Claire used to love about the kind of life she imagined for them someday. Long before either of them knew how little time remained, she had wanted a garden, the kind with vegetables in tidy rows and flowers, planted simply because they were beautiful rather than useful. She had wanted a porch wide enough for 2 chairs and a small table for evening coffee. She had wanted maple trees along the property line, because she had grown up beneath maple trees as a child and always said the sound of wind moving through their leaves felt like home. Daniel told Sophia, quietly, that he had planted those maples himself the spring after the funeral, not because anyone had asked him to, but because finishing the life Claire had imagined felt like the only conversation he still had left with her. Daniel explained that every repair in the house, every polished surface and patched wall, and freshly sealed porch board, wasn't an act of mourning at all. Though Sophia had initially assumed exactly that. It was an act of gratitude. He didn't fix things because he was stuck in the past, he told her. He fixed things because he refused to let the love they had built turn into neglect just because she was no longer there to see it. The second place setting at the table wasn't a sign of denial either, he admitted with a small, tired smile. It was a habit he had simply never wanted to break. A quiet ritual that reminded him every single day what he had promised to protect. Sophia sat across from him in that warm kitchen light. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had absolutely nothing to say. She had negotiated with senators and billionaires and men who tried to intimidate her across boardroom tables, and none of them had ever managed to leave her speechless the way this quiet, grease-stained man in a falling-down farmhouse just had. She realized, sitting there, that she had spent her entire adult life surrounded by people who measured worth in numbers, and she had never once met someone whose wealth was measured in memory. It was Daniel himself who eventually led her up the narrow staircase to the attic, almost as an afterthought, mentioning there was something else she might want to see if she truly wanted to understand. The attic was small and cramped, lit by a single round window that let in a soft wash of afternoon light, and tucked into a wooden chest near the far wall was a worn leather notebook, its cover cracked from years of handling. Daniel handed it to her without ceremony, the way someone hands over something they've stopped being afraid of. Inside, page after page, was a record. Every single day for years, Daniel had written down one thing he had repaired or maintained in the house. A loose hinge on the pantry door, a crack in the bathroom tile, the varnish on the porch steps. Some entries were only a sentence long. Others stretched into paragraphs, small reflections on what that particular repair had meant to him, what memory it had stirred, what piece of Claire it had brought briefly back to life. It wasn't a record of a house falling apart and being saved. It was the diary of a promise being kept, one nail and one brushstroke at a time, long after anyone would have blamed him for letting it go. One entry, dated nearly 3 years earlier, caught Sophia's attention longer than the others. Daniel had written about replacing a cracked windowpane in the bedroom, the one Claire used to sit beside on Sunday mornings with her coffee, watching the birds gather at the feeder she had hung from the maple tree closest to the house. He had written that fixing the glass felt less like a repair, and more like keeping a promise to let the light back in, exactly the way she would have wanted it. Further along, another entry described resealing the bathtub, accompanied by a brief memory of Claire humming old songs to herself while she filled it on cold winter evenings. Sophia turned page after page, watching years pass in small, careful handwriting, watching a man transform grief into something steady and quiet, and entirely his own. Sophia felt the tears before she understood why they were falling. She sat down on the dusty attic floor with that notebook open in her lap, and what rose up inside her wasn't pity for Daniel at all. It was something far more personal, a memory she had spent years trying not to think about. She thought of her own childhood home, the modest house in Ohio, where her parents had raised her before either of them had a single dollar to their name. The house she had sold without hesitation the moment she inherited it, eager to erase every trace of the poverty she had clawed her way out of. She had told herself at the time that selling it was practical, that sentimentality was a luxury she couldn't afford on her way to building something bigger. Sitting in Daniel's attic, surrounded by years of quiet devotion bound in leather, she understood for the first time what she had actually thrown away. Not a building, not an asset. A place where love had once lived, the way it still lived here, refusing to leave. For the first time in years, Sophia Hart allowed herself to regret something completely outside the realm of business. That night, back at her hotel, she called her mother for the first time in nearly 6 months. A conversation that began awkwardly and ended with both women crying quietly on opposite ends of the line. Sophia hadn't planned to bring up the old house in Ohio, the one she had sold without a second thought the year her father passed. But somehow the memory of Daniel's notebook had loosened something in her chest that she hadn't realized was still so tightly wound. Her mother told her gently that she had always understood why Sophia sold it, that no one could blame a daughter for wanting to outrun the hardship of her childhood. But hearing her mother say it out loud only made Sophia more certain that outrunning the past and honoring it were two entirely different things. And she had spent her whole adult life mistaking one for the other. In the days that followed, Sophia found herself unable to simply close the file on Daniel Carter and move on to the next negotiation the way she normally would have. Something about him stayed lodged in her thoughts, persistent and unresolved, and being the woman she was, she did what she always did when something didn't add up. She investigated. What her research team uncovered surprised even her. Daniel hadn't simply been a talented engineer before he walked away from his career. He had held several patents, technologies he had developed years earlier for structural reinforcement systems now used in buildings across the country, quiet innovations that had earned him a small fortune long before Claire ever got sick. Most of that fortune, Sophia discovered, had been donated. Scholarship funds for engineering students from low-income families, a grant program supporting hospice care research, established the same year Claire passed away. Daniel had never spoken publicly about any of it. There were no plaques with his name, no donor walls, no interviews. He had given quietly and consistently, the way some people pray, never expecting anyone to notice. Her research assistant, a sharp young woman named Megan, who had worked beneath Sophia for nearly 4 years, mentioned almost offhandedly that one of the engineering scholarships Daniel had funded was currently helping a student from rural Tennessee pay her way through a program that would otherwise have been completely out of reach. Sophia asked to see the file, and what she found there was a young woman's gratitude letter, written years earlier, thanking an anonymous donor she would never get to meet for changing the entire trajectory of her life. Sophia read that letter twice, then a third time, sitting alone in her office long after everyone else had gone home, feeling the particular weight of having spent a decade building skylines while a quiet, grieving man in a small town had been quietly rebuilding lives no one ever asked him to rebuild. Sophia sat with that information for a long time, turning it over the way she might examine a contract for a hidden clause. She had spent her career surrounded by men who announced every act of generosity before the ink on the check had dried, who built entire public images around philanthropy, timed perfectly for press releases. Daniel had given away more than most of those men ever would, and he had done it in complete silence, asking for nothing in return except the quiet satisfaction of having kept faith with someone he loved. She realized, with a clarity that startled her, that she had spent years chasing the wrong kind of wealth entirely. Daniel Carter, fixing tractors for farmers who could barely afford the parts, was without question the richest man she had ever sat across a table from. Back at her company's headquarters, the pressure to close the Maple Hollow deal only intensified. The board had grown impatient. Investors were asking pointed questions about delays. Her chief operating officer reminded her, more than once, that the entire residential project depended on acquiring that single parcel of land that, holding out for one stubborn homeowner, was costing the company real money every week. The deal remained unsigned. Analysts on quarterly calls began asking pointed questions about the stalled timeline, and rumors started circulating within the firm that Sophia Hart, the woman who had never once let sentiment slow down a deal, had somehow lost her edge in a town most of her executives had never even heard of before that quarter. Sophia listened to all of it, nodded in the right places, and then quietly booked another flight back to Maple Hollow, this time without a single document in her briefcase. When she arrived at Daniel's door the second time, she wasn't carrying a contract. She was carrying 2 cups of coffee, They talked for hours that afternoon, sitting on his freshly sealed porch, as the light slowly shifted across the yard. Daniel told her about the early days of his marriage, the modest apartment he and Claire had shared before either of them had any money. The long drives they used to take with no destination at all, simply because being in the car together felt like enough. He told her there were places in this world that couldn't be reduced to an appraisal value, no matter how sophisticated the formula, no matter how many comparable sales an analyst pulled up on a spreadsheet. Some places held something that simply couldn't be replaced once it was gone. And once you tore them down, you didn't just lose a structure. You lost every quiet moment that had ever happened inside it. Sophia found herself asking questions she rarely asked anyone, curious not about square footage or market value but about the small, ordinary texture of his days. She asked what time he woke up, whether he still listened to the same radio station playing softly in the workshop while he repaired engines, whether the quiet ever felt like too much. Daniel answered honestly, admitting that the first 2 years alone had nearly broken him, that there had been entire winters where the silence in the house felt like its own kind of weather, pressing in from every direction. He told her what had eventually pulled him through wasn't therapy or time, though both had helped in their own slow way, but the discipline of caring for something every single day, the way the notebook entries had given his grief somewhere useful to go. Sophia found herself, almost against her will, falling in love with the stillness of that porch. She had spent her whole life inside glass towers and crowded boardrooms, chasing a kind of success that always seemed to demand one more deal, one more quarter, one more milestone before she was finally allowed to rest. Sitting beside Daniel as the sun dipped behind the tree line, she felt something she hadn't felt in years, a complete and total absence of urgency. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she wasn't thinking about the next deal at all. She was simply present, in a small wooden chair, beside a man who had built an entire life around the idea that some things mattered more than profit. The changes Sophia made to the development plans began quietly, almost imperceptibly. The kind of adjustments that wouldn't draw attention unless someone was looking closely. She instructed her architects to redraw the site boundaries, shifting the planned residential block several hundred feet to the east, just enough to leave Daniel's parcel untouched at the center of the new design. She had her legal team explore historic preservation designations for the property, research that would have struck her as sentimental nonsense only weeks earlier. When her board questioned the revised timeline, she explained the changes in careful, businesslike language, citing community goodwill and long-term brand value, never once mentioning the real reason behind the redesign. The backlash, when it came swiftly. Her chief financial officer called the adjustment reckless, pointing out the additional costs the redesign would generate. 2 of her largest investors requested an emergency call, their voices tight, with the particular frustration of people who had expected a straightforward return and were now being asked to wait. One board member, a man who had sat on her company's leadership team since its founding, told her bluntly that he didn't recognize the woman making these decisions, that the Sophia Hart he had worked alongside for over a decade never let anything get in the way of a deal. Sophia listened to every objection without raising her voice. She had built her reputation on ruthless efficiency, and she understood exactly what she was risking by choosing differently now. But for the first time in her career, the easier path simply didn't feel like the right one, and she found she could live with the discomfort of disappointing her board far more easily than she could live with the thought of bulldozing that small house and everything it had quietly come to represent. When Sophia drove out to tell Daniel what she had done, she found him in the side yard repairing a section of fence that had finally given out after years of weather. She explained the redesign plainly, the rerouted blocks, the preservation filing, the cost her company would absorb to keep his home standing exactly where it had always stood. Daniel set down his tools and looked at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes that she hadn't seen there before. He didn't say very much. He didn't need to. The way he looked at her in that moment told her everything words might have only complicated. It was a Thursday in late October when the rain finally came. The kind of steady, soaking rain that seemed to settle over Maple Hollow and refuse to leave. Sophia drove out to the house anyway, despite her assistant's insistence that the meeting could easily wait for clearer weather. She arrived, soaked through, her usually immaculate appearance undone by wind and water, and Daniel opened the door without a word, simply stepping aside to let her in. He found her a dry sweater that had once belonged to him, made her tea in a chipped mug she had noticed and quietly admired on her very first visit, and set both of them by the fireplace while the storm rattled gently against the windows outside. They sat in comfortable silence for a long while, watching the flames, listening to the rain, neither of them in any particular hurry to fill the quiet with conversation. It was Sophia who finally spoke first, her voice smaller and more uncertain than Daniel had ever heard it. Sitting across from him in the kitchen, with rain streaking down the windows and the old clock ticking steadily in the next room, Sophia said the thing she had been carrying for weeks without quite knowing how to put it into words. She told him she hadn't come back to Maple Hollow that day for the land at all. Not really, not anymore. She had come back because of him, because something about the way he lived, quiet and deliberate and entirely unconcerned with what anyone else thought success should look like, had cracked something open in her that she had spent years keeping carefully sealed. Daniel was quiet for a long moment before he answered. He admitted that he had been afraid of exactly this, afraid of what it might mean to let someone new into a life he had built so carefully around a promise to someone who was gone. He told her he had worried, more than once over the years, that caring for someone again would somehow betray the memory he had spent so long protecting, that moving forward would mean leaving Claire behind in a way he wasn't sure he could survive. Sophia reached across the table and took his hand. She told him, gently but without hesitation, that loving again didn't erase the love that came before it. It simply meant there was room for more than one kind of love to live inside a single life. The way the house itself held both grief and joy, without either one canceling out the other. Daniel's eyes filled with tears he made no effort to hide. For a long moment, neither of them said anything else. Then he stood, crossed the small kitchen, and pulled her into an embrace that felt less like a beginning and more like a long overdue arrival. Two people who had each spent years building careful walls around their own kind of solitude, finally allowing those walls to come down at exactly the same moment. A year passed, and the development that had once threatened to erase Daniel's home from the map instead grew up carefully around it. The new neighborhood took shape exactly as Sophia had quietly redesigned it, with modern homes and tree-lined streets curved gently around the small, weathered house, at its center rather than through it. The town council, moved by the story that had slowly made its way through Maple Hollow, voted to designate the property as a historic site, a quiet monument to a kind of devotion the new residents would pass every single day without ever fully knowing the depth of what they were walking past. The people of Maple Hollow, who had once pitied Daniel openly, now spoke of him with an entirely different kind of respect, though it took most of them time to fully understand what had happened right under their noses. The same mothers who had used him as a cautionary tale began telling their children a different story instead, one about a man who had loved someone enough to keep a promise no one would have blamed him for breaking. The old men at the diner, who once shook their heads over his wasted potential, now nodded toward him with something closer to admiration whenever he walked through the door, finally understanding that the life he had built had never been a failure at all, only a kind of success the town simply hadn't had the language to recognize. Sophia, in the months that followed, established a foundation dedicated to preserving homes exactly like Daniel's, properties developers might otherwise have flattened in pursuit of the next profitable project. She traveled to towns across the country, identifying houses that held the same kind of quiet history Daniel's had held, working with families to protect them rather than erase them. Daniel, for his part, became a consultant for the foundation's restoration projects, traveling alongside her when his schedule allowed, teaching young architects and contractors the kind of patient, hands-on care that no engineering program had ever quite managed to teach him. He still fixed tractors for the local farmers when they needed him. He simply had less time for it now than he used to. The foundation's first major project outside Maple Hollow involved an elderly widow in rural Pennsylvania, a woman facing nearly the exact situation Daniel once had, a developer eager to buy out her family's land for a fraction of what it actually meant to her. Sophia and Daniel drove out together to meet her, and watching Daniel sit across from that stranger's kitchen table, listening with the same patient attention he had once received from no one but himself, Sophia understood more clearly than ever what she had found in him. He didn't just protect houses. He protected the idea that some things were worth protecting at all, an idea the world had nearly trained both of them to forget. The two of them moved into the small house together, not because either of them needed to escape anywhere else, but because they had both, in their own separate ways, found exactly where they belonged. It wasn't a decision born from nostalgia or obligation. It was a choice they made together, the same way Daniel had once chosen, every single day, to keep a promise that had outlasted the person who asked him to make it. On a quiet spring morning, sunlight spilled through the kitchen window in long golden bars, falling across the same wooden table that had once been set for a memory and was now set for something entirely different. The maples Daniel had planted years earlier had grown tall enough now to cast soft, shifting shadows across the porch. The same porch where two careful strangers had once sat in silence and slowly stopped being strangers at all. Sophia placed a second coffee cup down across from Daniel's, the steam curling upward into the morning light. And Daniel looked up at her with the kind of smile that no longer carried the weight of grief alone. The table that had once held a place for someone who was gone now held two people who were simply, finally, there together. As the camera of memory pulled slowly back from that small house, nestled among the trees, one truth remained, quiet and unshakable as the house itself. A home does not become precious because of the value of the land beneath it. It becomes precious because of the love and the promises that continue living inside its walls. And when someone is honest enough and brave enough to honor another person's past with genuine care, they often find they are no longer just protecting what came before. They are quietly building, together, something entirely new.